For the world this week, 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour, and joining us from Newsweek and the Daily Beast, Christopher Dickey, how are you? Also with us, Ed Cody of the Washington Post, Marjorie Paillon of Tech24 fame here on France 24, presents the show in French, and Charles Onyango-Obo, digital media editor for Kenya's The Nation newspaper group, who happens to be in Paris for a UNESCO conference devoted to social networking, WikiLeaks. What else was on the menu?
News of the world.
And News of the World, okay. The World This Week, which you can follow on Facebook and also on Twitter, where we can catch us at François F24. 1 year ago, Tunisia and Egypt had just experienced regime change. Protests had begun in the Gulf monarchy of Bahrain. The Arab Spring was then about to take a radically new course. Libya started rising up against its leader of 42 years. And this was no Facebook revolution, this was a civil war. And when Muammar Gaddafi's son, Saif al-Islam, promised rivers of blood, the Arab League took the case to the UN, and the West stepped in with air raids, turning the tide. 1 year on, France 24's David Thompson went to Tripoli and spoke with militiamen from Misrata, who are in the capital, manning checkpoints, and who refuse to lay down their weapons.
It's still not 100% safe here. Tripoli's the capital. If the capital falls, everything's lost.
Christopher Dickey, the situation in Tripoli, is it as chaotic as you expected 1 year ago?
Yeah, I'd say it's less chaotic than I feared it might be. After you take a dictator who's been in power for decades and has had a lid on all the cultural and tribal and social differences that exist in a country, and then you take that lid off, you can expect that there's going to be a lot of unrest. And if everybody is armed, you can expect there's going to be a lot of militias around. I think everybody hoped it wouldn't work out that way, but I don't think it's surprising that it has at this juncture.
All right, one of the interesting surveys done, and this is, I guess, shows up the fact that Libya is a country where there are tribal affiliations, but also very much an urban population. Oxford University's polling center surveying more than 2,000 Libyans across the country. The findings slightly ambiguous. There you see the numbers. Do you think your life is better off or worse? 75% say it's better off. Libyans, though, overwhelmingly agree they're better off, but only 2/3 want participatory democracy. 1 in 3 wishes they had a stronger ruler in the end. And also there was another question posed, which was who helped topple Gaddafi the most? First on that list was La France, and second, Qatar, ahead of the UK and the US. Your thoughts on this, Ed Cody, when you see these surveys?
Well, I think that's a very accurate reading of what happened. France was, of course, responsible because the president of France, Nicolas Sarkozy, got things going. He's the one who was the impulse behind a lot of what happened. And then the money bags was Qatar, which came along with a lot of financing, a lot of help in the Arab League, a lot of what happened in the Arab League that ended up allowing the no-fly zone and the air support was generated by Qatar, and particularly the non-Tripoli groups got a lot of weapons in addition to support and trainers from Qatar. So Qatar was in a great measure responsible for what happened.
What's the perception, Charles, in Kenya as to the conflict in Libya? Colonel Gaddafi was the main backer of the African Union. There were mixed feelings on the continent throughout the past year of what was going on.
I think the mixed feelings were by the African Union, which felt sidelined. But I think in most of Africa, this is a typical pattern. You know, the big man falls, there is a vacuum. And in many ways, you can say it's a good thing. Why is it good? Because I think when you have this kind of chaos, if you have every militia has its arms, I think it forces the new regime to negotiate. Because one of the what you don't want in a situation like that is you get rid of one strong man and another strong man comes. So In a way, it can be messy and sometimes bloody, but whenever these regimes are forced to negotiate with militias, however obnoxious they are, it's actually a better situation.
Sort of a standoff between different groups. By the way, on Twitter, our colleague Hervé Penot from newspaper L'Équipe, when he saw that we had posted that Oxford University poll, said, "A poll in Libya? Please, it's a joke, isn't it?" Marjorie Payon, it is difficult to gauge public opinion in a situation like this.
Yeah, actually, but the role of social media in the Libyan crisis was something way different than what happened in Egypt and in Tunisia. Because here in Libya, you don't have a lot of people online. You don't have a lot of people really acting online. You had more people acting online abroad. And social media definitely facilitated what we could actually call leaderless movements, such as in Libya. But it wasn't like a stunt, like the boost that was definitely the case in Egypt and Tunisia. It was something different in Libya.
And it was definitely a civil war from the get-go. In Syria, it's taken months to gestate into violent armed conflict, but it's now fast becoming one. The battle lines that Le Monde photographer Mani discovered in the besieged city of Homs, now those battle lines, confessional.
It's an explosive city. The Sunni who live in streets where there's a majority of Alawites are persecuted. And vice versa, Alawites living in Sunni neighborhoods have had to leave under pressure from their opponents.
So Alawites forced to leave, Sunnis taking in. This is the nightmare scenario that we had dreaded.
Well, it's absolutely predictable. I mean, I hate to keep saying these things are predictable, but they are. You know, the Alawites are looking at a situation where they see this as a war for survival for them. They are a small minority, maybe 10% of the population, but they're the minority that's been running the country. They're the people who are identified with the Assad clan, and the Assads have run Syria like a mafia, running its territory for a very long time. The idea that they could come down and everything would be fine for all those Alawites except for the Assads is not something that the Alawites themselves believe, and it's already being acted on and acted out in places like Homs.
Interesting thing we've seen as well as this conflict becomes bloodier and bloodier is the conflict fitting into more classic battle lines. Some even argue slightly retro, East versus West, with Russia and China vetoing a Security Council resolution. But this week hints that there is wiggle room when it comes to France's suggestion of a humanitarian corridor.
The minister told me that they are thinking about a new resolution which would be intended to help delivery of humanitarian assistance to the Syrian population in Syria with consent of all those who have arms on the ground. In other words, this would be not a Chapter 7 resolution. And he said that they're thinking about this, and I expressed my readiness to take a look at it as soon as it is ready.
Ed Cody, do you have the sense that the Russians could maybe come to the table at some point?
Well, there's a lot of pressure on them, and the fact that they're so out there, separated from the rest of the big powers, I think is probably something they're not very comfortable with. But on the other hand, there's a little bit of a chickens coming home to roost problem here, where the Security Council resolution that France, joined by Britain and the United States and so on, was so forceful in getting passed, was a little bit of a flim-flam, if you remember, the one on Libya, where we were going there only to have a no-fly zone and protect Syria, when in fact what the French, British, and American governments did, or military did, was fly air cover, air support, sometimes close air support, for an armed rebellion.
Some say even captured Colonel Gaddafi.
Well, they certainly blasted his convoy, didn't they? Yes. So if I was a Russian diplomat and I was looking at Security Council resolutions, I'd read the fine print, and I think that's a little bit what they're doing.
That's the first lesson drawn from the conflict in Libya, where Syria, there is going to be this line in the sand.
Well, I think there are a couple of dangerous lessons for going forward from Libya. One is exactly what Ed's talking about. It's much harder to get UN resolutions through because there's a sense that basically NATO cheated on the resolution, that it pushed it further than the Russians and the Chinese wanted. But the other lesson is for the Iranians, who are looking at this and saying, oh, let me think. Now, Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program, didn't he? And he was the darling of the West until there were some riots in Benghazi, and the next thing you know, NATO's bombing his country. What's in it for us to give up our nuclear program? Those are the kinds of lessons that people are taking out of Libya that I don't think were anticipated at the time, but they're very clear lessons.
The other lesson is, of course, the issue of as the conflict becomes more militarized. We saw today the French president basically tell the Syrian opposition to get its act together, and which is something they didn't do in Libya.
Yeah, there has to be one interlocutor for the foreign governments for practical reasons and also for image reasons. They need someone to put up there. That was one of the real advantages that the Libyans had, is they had a professorial-looking representative.
Well, they had Henri Levy, huh?
Well, they had him too,
French
yes.
intellectual.
But they had a man they could put up in front of the television camera and who looked kindly. And I think the Syrians need somebody like that too, and they need someone to sit down and talk with the Qataris about how many guns they're going to get in the next shipment as well.
You know, I think the Russians actually have a point on all this. I mean, the whole side, the way this debate is being conducted in the West is the Syrian government is all wrong and the opposition is all right. Well, we don't really know much about the opposition. We know that people are suffering and dying, but we don't really know who these fighters are, where they come from, what they're about.
The State Department this week talking about allegations that Al-Qaeda in Iraq
Al-Qaeda is definitely trying to exploit this. There's no question about that. And that doesn't mean they're running it. But at the same time, let's say you get rid of Bashar al-Assad and his family. Then what? Then who takes over? How do you steer this toward a peaceful solution? And I don't think anybody has the answer to that question, and I think that's one reason nobody's getting very deeply involved in Syria.
All right, let's ask the media-savvy Charles Onyango Obo here. How do you get your information regarding Syria when we've been relying, all of us, since March 15th on amateur video footage? Until very recently, there were no Western reporters in there.
I think that's basically it. One of the things that strikes me, I think the problem I see with the humanitarian corridor is that creates a legitimacy crisis for the Assad regime, because that's how it begins. Because a humanitarian corridor is an area which you don't control. Now, the second thing I see is that after, Libya and all these places, how many times is Russia and China willing to keep losing these battles? I think the time has come when, the West, NATO, needs to give Russia and China something, because I think that if this just continues, I think it also becomes untenable for the Chinese and the Russians, particularly their domestic constituencies.
So a question of herd pride. Also with, I guess you could say, classic battle lines drawn this week. You were mentioning Syria's partner, Iran. And this week we saw attacks and explosions that Israel attributes to Iran in India, Georgia, Thailand. The response, observers argue, to the recent assassination of yet another Iranian nuclear scientist. Christopher Dickey, you contributed to a piece that expresses the fear that Israel could soon perhaps start a conflict that Washington will have to finish.
Absolutely. I mean, if Israel attacks Iran, there's almost no way you can see a scenario in which they start a war that the United States is not in a position where it has to try to finish it. And the Obama administration, the last thing it wants is another war in the Muslim world at this point or at any point. So really what the Israelis are doing is playing, what that article says, is that the Israelis are essentially playing a game of chicken in two directions, not just one, not just with the Iranians, but with the Americans. And when they feel that the Americans are not on board with them, over the last year, they have suddenly cut out intelligence cooperation with the Americans, just gone silent, which of course made Washington very concerned that something was going on that they couldn't control or predict.
Now this Friday, the U.S. Secretary of State in the company of the EU Foreign Policy Chief saying that they're encouraged by a letter the Iranians have sent them saying they want to negotiate. Is this a way as well to perhaps tell the Israelis, whoa, hold on?
Yeah, look, I mean, what are the sanctions about? The letter is partly in response to the very, very harsh sanctions that have now been imposed on Iran. But the sanctions are also aimed at Israel, saying, look, we're making them crack. We're making them break down in Tehran. We may not make them stop their nuclear program, but at least something's happening. And so what the Americans want to say is, you see, now they're offering to negotiate. The other side of it is, the Iranians wanted to show that they could make the whole fuel cycle in the nuclear program. They now claim that they've done that. It's not clear that they have, but they now claim that they've done that. So they can go to their own people and say, we did what we wanted to do. Now we're ready to talk.
French newspaper Le Journal du Dimanche last week showed 3 different scenarios for an attack on Iran from Israel. It does look a bit tricky if you look at that. One involves going through Turkey, another through a southern route. It just doesn't seem very feasible.
Well, the aerial refueling that would be necessary is, I think, probably the key. It would that would determine how many aircraft the Israelis could field in a bombing attack. They don't have enough to do a really massive bombing attack, and as Chris was just saying, it's unlikely that they'd get a loan from the Obama administration, so they're limited in how many aircraft they can send, particularly if they want to come around the south or the northern side. They can't get there without a lot of aerial refueling.
But Iraq doesn't have any air defense capability to mention. They'll just fly straight over Jordan and Iraq.
If they're going to do it, that's what they'll do, yeah.
All right, before we go to the break, a word on the death of a colleague, the Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times reporter Anthony Shadid, who succumbed to an asthma attack inside Syria while walking to the border because it was too dangerous to ride by car. Chris Verdicki, you met him in the field.
Yeah, he was a wonderful colleague. I mean, he was smart. He had great instincts. He knew the region extremely well. He wrote beautifully. And he just had a lot of soul, covering a region that requires a lot of soul if you want to understand it. And it's just incredibly depressing that he's dead at the age of 43. I mean, it really leaves a hole not only in the New York Times coverage, but I think it just leaves a hole in the whole press corps that covers the Middle East.
All right. Stay with us. The World This Week continues in a moment. We'll be turning our sights on the United States and the red carpet treatment for China's heir apparent.